Namaskar students. We are moving to our English lecture number 80, and here we are moving into the theories of international relations. We are still in one of the major theories of IR. Last lecture we did on the classical realists. In this lecture we'll go into the neoclassical realists, people in the 20th century who revived these ideas from political theory. We will be dealing with Hans Morganthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, Raymond Aron, and Henry Kissinger. Right, so we will be going into their ideas and thoughts. What have been this? This is one of the major schools of international relations, as I told you earlier as well. Now to Hans Morganthau. This is a picture of Hans Morganthau. He is known for his notable work called Politics Among Nations. This was the book that was a Bible for us when I was doing my post-graduation at the Presidency College in Madras. Wonderful book, great to read, very well written. It was one of the major works of the 20th century, figures of international relations. He's a German-American. And as I told you, most important book, Politics Among Nations. Several editions have come out. Now, this is thought to be a main paradigm shift, this book, because realism seeks to study the struggle for power, among which every nation tries to maintain or increase its power. Thus, political realism has a distinctive approach. And for that matter, it stands for political standards, for political acts. And it believes in the autonomy of the political. Morganthau's Scientific Man versus Power Politics argued that an over-reliance on science and technology as solutions that politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Classical realist theory, as we did in the last lecture, explains international relations through assumptions about human nature. Hans Morganthau, in his book Politics Among Nations, states that there are certain objective laws that have their roots in human nature. He's seen as one of the founding fathers of international relations, and especially the realist school that dominates international relations study as a subject in the 20th century. The school of thought holds that nation states are the main actors in international relations, and that is why they are also known as a state-centric theory. Hans Morganthau is considered as one of the founding fathers of the realist school, and as most of you know, this school concentrates on power and national interest. And in the Politics Among Nations, there is an attempt to define power and structuralize it with national interest. Other works, recently scholarly assessments of Morganthau show that his intellectual trajectory was more complicated than originally thought. His realism was infused with moral consideration, though not always openly acknowledged. And during the last part of his life, he favored supranational control of nuclear weapons, strongly opposed the US role in the Vietnam War. And as have you seen very clearly, he believes in a pessimistic view of human nature, centered on a universal lust for power and the inevitability of selfishness. Like Hannah Arendt, Morganthau dedicated time and effort to the support of the State of Israel after its creation following the World War II. Both Morganthau and Arendt made annual trips to Israel to lend their established academic voices to its young and growing academic community during the inaugural decades. And if you see to Morganthau's interests in Israel extended further to related issues of geopolitics and to the issues related to Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn. Morganthau was a consultant for the Kennedy administration from 1961 to 63. He was a strong supporter of the Roosevelt and Truman administrations When Eisenhower administration gained the White House, Morganthau turned his efforts towards large amount of writing for journals and the press in general. By the time Kennedy election in 1960, he had become a consultant to the Kennedy administration. When Johnson became president, Morganthau became much more vocal in his dissent concerning American participation in the Vietnam War, for which he was dismissed as a consultant to the Johnson administration in 1965. This debate with Morganthau has been related in books about policy advisors. Now, what are the 6 principles of political realism? The greatness of Morganthau is he was able to structurally make a theory for realism, especially political realism. And he created what is called the 6 principles of political realism. What are those 6 principles? 1, politics is rooted in a permanent, unchanging human nature, which is basically self-centered, self-regarding, and self-interested. It says that human nature is very predominant in influencing the way we behave as human beings. Politics, number 2, is an autonomous sphere of action and cannot therefore be reduced to morals. That is the primacy of the political. That finally it is the primacy of the political. Second, third, self-interest is a basic fact of the human condition. International politics is an arena of conflicting state interests, but interests are not fixed. The world is in a flux and interests can change. Realism is a doctrine that responds to the fact of a changing political reality. Fourth, the ethics of international relations is a political or situational ethics is very different from private morality. The leader responsible to the people who depend on him or her. The responsible leader should strive to do the best that circumstances permit on that particular day. That circumscribed situation of political choice is the normative heart of the classical realist ethics. Here, if you see, realists are therefore opposed to the idea of a particular and can impose their ideologies on other nations. Realists oppose. Ultimately, they believe that it could backfire and threaten the crusading countries. Statecraft is a sober, uninspiring activity that involves profound awareness of human limitations and human imperfections. The pessimistic knowledge the political realist also maintains the autonomy of the political sphere. The statesman asks, how does the policy affect the power and interests of the nation? Political realism is based on a pragmatic conception of human nature. The political realist must show where the nation's interests differ from the moralistic and legalistic viewpoints. And here, if most of you read Politics Among Nations, he gives the example of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is a very good Christian personally in his life. He never hurt anybody, but when the country, United States, was threatened of division, of a breakaway South on the basis of slavery, he was ready to fight a civil war to keep the country united, thereby killing thousands. So according to the realists, he's a great nationalist, he's a very strong leader and a successful leader. Thoughts and ideas. Men and women are by nature political animals. They are born to pursue power and enjoy the fruits of power. Animus dominandi, the human lust for power. The ultimate political space within which security can be arranged and enjoyed is the independent state. Security beyond the state and with states is impossible. Animus dominandi creates a condition of power politics. Politics is struggle for power over men. And whatever its aim, power is the immediate goal. And the modes of acquiring, maintaining, and demonstrating it determine the technique. So, If you see to a large extent, they say that the human lust for power is very strong. We are seeing it even in today's politics and today's things, what's happening all over the country. They will have to organize themselves into a capable, effective state by means they can defend interests. The anarchical system of states invites international conflict. So anarchy, the structure of the international system, the struggle between states leads to the problem of justifying the threat or use of force in human relations. Political ethics allows some actions that would not be tolerated by private morality. Morganthau quotes Plato, who spoke of the noble lie. Our rulers will probably have to make considerable use of lies and deceit for the good of their subjects. The awareness that all political ends defending the national interest in times of war must sometimes morally be questionable or morally tainted meanings lead to situational ethics and dictates political wisdom, prudence, moderation, judgment, resolve, courage, and so on. They do not preclude evil actions. Instead, they underline the tragic dimension of international ethics. They recognize the inevitability of moral dilemmas in international relations. The evil actions must sometimes be taken to prevent a greater evil. So what is the concept of statecraft? Please understand, realism is also called a state-centric theory. For them, as I told you, the state is a very important. First, human nature, basic condition, self-interest, animus dominandi, roughly translated intense burning desire for power. In real life, the deeply rooted strong will and wherewithal to dominate other people to the exclusion of all else. Two, political situation, means and context. Power politics, political power, political circumstances, political skills. 3, political conduct, goals and values, political ethics, prudence, human necessity, security, national interest, balance of power. Now we'll move on to the second major thinker, Reinhold Niebuhr. Karl Paul Reinhold Niebuhr, 1892 to 1971, was an American Reformed theologian, ethist, commentator of politics and public affairs, and professor at the Union Seminary for more than 30 years. He basically wrote on the idea of moral man and immoral society. As a theologian, Niebuhr is best known for Christian realism, which emphasized the persistent roots of evil in human lives. In his Moral Man and Immoral Society, that was published in 1932, he stressed the egoism and the pride and hypocrisy of nations. God grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's a very famous quotation. We keep quoting it. Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. How prophetic. He was a public intellectual. Niebuhr was one of America's leading public intellectuals for several decades of the 20th century, and he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. A public theologian, he wrote and spoke frequently about the intersection of religion, politics, and public policy, with his most influential books including Moral Man and Immoral Society and The Nature and Destiny of Man. The latter is ranked number 18 of the top 100 fiction books of the 20th century by Modern Library. Andrew Bavich labeled Niebuhr's book, The Irony of American History, the most important book ever written on US foreign policy. The historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. described Niebuhr as the most influential American theologian of the 20th century, and Time posthumously called Niebuhr the greatest Protestant theologian in America after Jonathan Edwards. Now, what is his Christian realism? Can there be a Hindu realism? Starting as a minister with working class sympathies in the 1920s and sharing with many other ministers a commitment to pacifism and socialism, his thinking evolved during the 1930s to neo-orthodox realist theology as he developed a philosophical perspective known as Christian realism. He attacked utopianism as ineffectual for dealing with reality, writing in The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, 1944. Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Niebuhr's realism deepened after 1945 and led him to support American efforts to confront Soviet communism around the world. A powerful speaker, he was one of the most influential thinkers of the 1940s and 50s in public affairs. Niebuhr's contribution in utilizing the resources of theology to argue for political realism. His work has also significantly influenced international relations theory and leading many scholars to move away from idealism and embrace realism. Within this framework of Christian realism, Niebuhr became a supporter of the American action in the Second World War, anti-communism, and development of nuclear weapons. However, he opposed the Vietnam War. At the outbreak of World War II, the pacifist component of his liberalism was challenged. Niebuhr began to distance himself from the pacifism of his more liberal colleagues and became a staunch advocate for the war. Niebuhr soon left the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a peace-oriented group of theologians and ministers, and became one of their harshest critics. This departure from his peers evolved into a movement known as Christian realism. Niebuhr was widely considered to have been its primary advocate. Niebuhr supported the Allies during the Second World War and argued for the engagement of the United States in the war. As a writer popular in both secular and religious arena and a professor of the Union Theological Seminary, he was very influential both in the United States and abroad. While many clergy proclaimed themselves as pacifists because of their World War I experiences, Niebuhr declared that the victory in Vietnam is not very good for the United States or for the world. So if you see, to a very large extent, he was very against. He declared the victory of Germany and Japan would threaten Christianity. He renounced his socialistic connections and beliefs and resigned from the pacifistic Fellowship of Reconciliation. He based his arguments on Protestant beliefs that sin is a part of the world, that justice must take precedence over love, and that pacifism is a symbolic portrayal of the absolute love but cannot prevent sin. Although his opponents did not portray him favorably, Niebuhr's exchanges with them on the issue helped him to mature intellectually. Niebuhr claimed himself to be a realist, realpolitik, who opposed the use of political power to attain moral ends. Morrison and his followers strongly supported the movement to outlaw war that began after the First World War and the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. The pact was severely challenged by the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. With the publication of Moral Man and Immoral Society in 1932, Niebuhr broke ranks with the Christian century and supported interventionism and power politics. He supported the re-election of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940 and published his own magazine. In 1945, however, Niebuhr charged that use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima was morally indefensible. So if you see, traditionally, the idea of frailty of man led to the obedience to an ordained authority, but Niebuhr rejected that ancient conservative argument. Ordained authority, showed, is all the more subject to some temptations of self-interest, self-deception, and self-righteousness. Power must be balanced by power. He persuaded me and many of my contemporaries that original sin provides a far stronger foundation for freedom and self-freedom than illusions about human perfectibility. Niebuhr's analysis was grounded in the Christianity of Augustine and Calvin, but he had now nonetheless a special affinity with secular circles. His warnings against utopianism, messianism, and perfectionism strike a chord today. We cannot play the role to history, and we must strive as best as we can to attain decency, clarity, and proximate justice in an ambiguous world. This is what Arthur Schlesinger said about his influence on the international relations and realist thought. He also was a member of Americans for Democratic Action. After Joseph Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Adolf Hitler in August 3, 1939, Niebuhr severed his past ties with any fellow traveler organization having any known communist leanings. In 1947, Niebuhr helped found the Liberal Americans for Democratic Action. His ideas influenced George Kennan, Hans Morganthau, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and other realists during the Cold War on the need to contain communist expansion. In 1950s, Niebuhr described Joseph McCarthy as a force of evil, not so much for attacking civil liberty as for being ineffective in rooting out communists and their sympathizers. In 1953, he said, traitors are never ordinary criminals, and Rosenbergs are quite obviously fiercely loyal communists. Stealing atomic secrets is an unprecedented crime. He opposed the Ku Klux Klan. His views developed during his pastoral tenure in Detroit, which had become a place of immigration, migration, competition, and development as a major industrial city. During the 1920s, Niebuhr spoke out against the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Detroit, which had recruited many members threatened by the rapid social changes. The Klan proposed positions that were anti-Black, anti-Jewish, and anti-Catholic. Niebuhr's preaching against the Klan, especially in relation to the 1925 mayoral elections, gained him national attention. Niebuhr's thoughts on racial justice developed slowly after he abandoned socialism. Niebuhr attributed the injustices of society to human pride and self-love, and believed that this innate propensity for evil could not be controlled by humanity. But he believed that a representative democracy can improve society's evils. Like Edmund Burke, Niebuhr endorsed natural evolution over imposed image and emphasized experience over theory. Niebuhr's Burkean ideology, however, often conflicted with his liberal principles, particularly regarding his perspective on racial justice. Here there's a very important thing that I want all of you to draw your attention. Reinhold Niebuhr and Martin Luther King. It's very important today because the ideas of Reinhold Niebuhr echo in today's American society, also with Black Lives Matter on one side, and on the other side, all lives matter, and the issue of white supremacists. He is very, very relevant to all these narratives that are coming in today in discourses. In the letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, individuals may see the moral right and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. King drew heavily upon Niebuhr's social and ethical ideals. King invited Niebuhr to participate in the Third Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, and Niebuhr responded by telegram, "Only a severe stroke prevents me from accepting. I hope there will be a massive demonstration of all the citizens with conscience in favor of the elemental human rights of voting and freedom of assembly." 2 years later, Niebuhr defended King's decision to speak out against the Vietnam War, calling him one of the greatest religious leaders of our time. Niebuhr asserted Dr. King has the right and a duty, as both a religious and a civil rights leader, to express his concern in these days about such a major human issue. He thought that his intervention in Vietnam, Niebuhr admitted that I am ashamed of our own beloved nation. So if you see very clearly, he had a very good relations with ideas with Dr. Martin Luther King, and he's seen as one of the greatest realists, Christian realists of the century. Now we move on from US realists to the continental realists, the great French realist Raymond Aron. I was introduced to Raymond Aron when I joined JNU. Professor K.P. Mishra, who was my supervisor, was a person who introduced me to two scholars I never knew at all. One was Martin White, and the other was Raymond Aron. Raymond Aron was a French philosopher, sociologist, political scientist, and a journalist. Aron wrote extensively on a wide variety of other topics. Citing the breadth and quality of Aron's writings, historian James Garland suggests, though he may be little known in America, Raymond Aron arguably stood as the preeminent example of one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century. These are the French intellectuals, Aron and Foucault. Both were Jewish. The most important book of Raymond Aron is The Opium of the Intellectuals. All of you who are good sociology students who are also writing the civil services must read him. He's also a great sociologist. He is best known for his 1955 book, The Opium of the Intellectuals, the title of which inverts Karl Marx's claim that religion was the opium of the people. Aron argues that in post-war France, Marxism is the opium of the intellectuals. In the book, Aron chastised French intellectuals for what he described as their harsh criticism of capitalism and democracy, and their simultaneous defense of Marxist oppression, atrocities, and intolerance. Critic Roger Kimball suggests that Opium is a seminal book of the 20th century. Aron is also known for his lifelong friendship, sometimes factitious, with philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. As a voice of moderation in politics, Aron had many disciples of both the political left and right, but he remarked that he personally was more of a left-wing Aronian than a right-wing one. Intellectual who no longer feels attached to anything is not so much of an opium merely. He was for certainty, he wants a system. The revolution provides him with his opium. The body of work by a realist cold warrior. In Berlin, Aron witnessed the rise of power of the Nazi party and developed an aversion to all totalitarian systems. In 1938, he participated in the colloque Walter Lippmann in Paris. By the 1950s, he had grown very critical of the Austrian school and described their obsession with private property as inverted Marxism. Aron always promoted an immoderately moderate form of liberalism, which accepted a mixed economy as the normal economic model of the age. Aron is the author of books on Karl Marx and Karl von Clausewitz. In Peace and War, he set out a theory of international relations. He argues that Martin Weber's claim that the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force does not apply to the relationship between states. In the field of international relations in the 1950s, Aron hypothesized that despite the advent of nuclear weapons, nations would still require conventional military forces. The usefulness of such forces would be made necessary by what he called a nuclear taboo. Peace and War, a theory of IR. Peace is the proper between states, but understanding how and why wars occur might help to bring more peaceful relations. He denied that there is value-free social science. Philosophy can never be divorced from theory or history of practice. Rejected unilateral and unidimensional explanations of IR. Homogeneous systems, when the major parts share similar regimes and conceptions of policy and justice. Heterogeneous systems, regimes are organized according to different principles and appeal to contrary values. The philosophy of history, his greatest influence was teaching them how to think about history, politics, and society, or rather how to think if one refused all secular religions, all philosophies of history that pretend to know the purpose and the march of mankind, that begin by rejecting the world as it is and aim at total revolution. He is right in his memoirs to stress the continuity of his works since his thesis Introduction to the Philosophy of History, published in 1938. After his experience in Germany during the 1930s and his reflections and 2 books on German sociologists and historians, he developed the idea of a historical philosophy that was neither rationalist nor ideological nor positivist. It was a philosophy emphasizing tensions and disparities between intentions and results, between absolute commitments and dubious courses of action, between comprehension of motives and ideas and explanation of regularities, between prospective choices made in uncertainty and retrospective interpretations which lean towards determinism, between the intelligibility part of parts of history and how the difficulty or impossibility of grasping the whole of it, between the diversity of culture and values and interpretations and the idea of reason, the dream of a single universal destiny and destination, between politics as reformist reformation and politics as salvation. What his ideas and principles, if we see to a large extent, is he was actually trying to lay the groundwork for a gigantic task, a rigorous and clinical analysis of the political and social realities that would reject determinism and focus on different types of social activities, such as industrial society or foreign policy, as well as on the interplay between these logics and historical accidents. At the same time, he undertook a defense of liberal political and economic institutions based on a commitment to freedom, tolerance, and moderation. In the study of political regimes like Tocqueville and Montesquieu before him, Aron believed in the autonomy and irreducible diversity of political institutions. Like Tocqueville, he published that a single type of social order, such as industrial society, would take completely different shapes, depending on the nature, pluralistic or totalitarian, of its political regime. The continuous and relentless analysis, empirical as well as theoretical, of international relations, a field of inquiry that has remained in France, the preserve of historians and law professors. World politics for him differed fundamentally from domestic politics because of the state's freedom to resort to force. That is, the absence of a superior and enforceable law, a state of affairs that ruled out pacifism except as an absolute apolitical imperative. In Peace and War, 1962, he wrote the most comprehensive and convincing theory of interstate politics achieved until now, and while he reminded his readers of the immorality of politics, he did not neglect what might be called the Kantian dimension, the tension between a moral imperative of peace and the realities of the state of war among nations. Whether nuclear deterrence would heal or exacerbate the tension was one of the greatest concerns, not only in that book, but in the second volume of his study on Clausewitz. His contribution to continental realism. Aron thought that the assertion of freedom through violence, of disalienation through revolution, was philosophically objectionable, politically dangerous, and closer to anarchism than to authentic Marxism. He shows how intellectual can strive, if not for objectivity, which may be unattainable, at least for fairness. The difficult art of not letting one's values prejudge one's conclusions or dominate the process of analysis. He also taught the art of making rigorous distinctions, not only between concepts, but also between realities. There are different kinds of violence in politics, different shades of gray, just as there are different logics interacting in a society and different purposes served by the political order. He showed that all good things do not cohere, and that many good things, such as political pluralism, have perverse effects, such as unceasing battle of parties and pressure groups. Aron is a supreme destroyer, not of hopes, but of confusions and illusions. Aron's vision of mankind was tragic. Violence is the midwife of societies and states. The avoidance of nuclear war is no more than a myth, but the Kantian in him never gave up the hope of reason. Prevailing endepit detail. For all his coldness, this formidable polemicist was a passionate man, but one who had decided to dominate his emotions and not to let them blind his vision or skew his analysis. So Raymond Aron was an intellectual par excellence, a political realist who brought a totally new perspective to realism and one of the greatest critiques of Marxism. A great sociologist, a great intellectual, a person who strode through several disciplines with great means. And finally, to the man who practiced real politics, Heinz Alfred Kissinger. Henry is an American politician, diplomat, he's still alive, and geopolitical consultant who served as a United States Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under the presidential administrations of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Peace, Legitimacy, and the Equilibrium. This was the title of his doctoral dissertation. It was a study of the statesmanship of Castlereagh and Metternich. Most of you who know international relations will remember that these were the stalwarts of the 1815 Congress of Vienna. In his PhD dissertation, Kissinger first introduced the concept of legitimacy, which he defined as legitimacy as used here should not be confused with justice. It means no more than an international agreement about the nature of workable arrangements and about permissible aims and methods of foreign policy. An international order accepted by all of the major powers is legitimate, whereas an international order not accepted by one or more of the great powers is revolutionary and hence dangerous. Thus, when after the Congress of Vienna in 1850, the leaders of Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia agreed to cooperate in the concert of Europe to preserve the peace. In Kissinger's viewpoint, this international system was legitimate because it was accepted by the leaders of all the 5 great powers of Europe. Notably, Kissinger's approach to diplomacy took it for granted that as long as the decision makers in the major states were willing to accept the international order, then it is legitimate with questions of public opinion and morality dismissed as irrelevant. Recent analysis. On April 3rd, 2020, Kissinger shared his diagnostic view of the COVID-19 pandemic, saying that it threatens the liberal world order. Kissinger added that the virus does not know borders. All the global leaders are trying to address the crisis on a mainly national basis. He stressed that the key is not purely national effort, but greater international cooperation. But if more and more intelligence becomes opaque, how will policymakers understand the views and ability of their adversaries, perhaps even allies? Will many different internets emerge, or in the end only one? What will be the implications for cooperation, for confrontation? As artificial intelligence becomes ubiquitous, new concepts for its security need to emerge. Most of you know artificial intelligence is seen as one of the frontiers. Recently, even the Indian Prime Minister made a statement that India should become a hub for artificial intelligence research. He also spoke on computers and nuclear weapons. In 2019, Kissinger wrote that about the tendency to give control of nuclear weapons to computers operating with artificial intelligence, that adversaries' ignorance of artificial intelligence developed configurations will become a strategic advantage. Kissinger argued that giving power to launch nuclear weapons to computers using algorithms to make decisions would eliminate the human factor and give the advantage to the state that has the most effective artificial intelligence system, as a computer can make decisions about war and peace far faster than human ever could. But as an artificial intelligence enhanced computer can win chess games by anticipating human decision making, an artificial intelligence enhanced computer could be useful in a crisis, as in a nuclear war. The side that strikes first would have the advantage by destroying the opponent's nuclear capacity. Kissinger also noted there was always the danger that a computer would make a decision to start a nuclear war, that before diplomacy had been exhausted, or the algorithm controlling the artificial intelligence might make a decision to start a nuclear war that would not be understandable to the operators. Kissinger also warned that the use of artificial intelligence to control nuclear weapons would impose opacity in the decision making. Artificial intelligence systems are not readily understandable, destabilizing the decision making process. As a grand strategy requires an understanding of the capabilities and military deployment of political adversity. So he was talking about limitations. When talking about Kissinger and his realism, he was the one credited with opening up China in 1973, recognition of communist China. In India, he is not liked very much because he was the one who and Richard Nixon were responsible for supporting Pakistan and forming the triangle. So India was forced into an Indo-Soviet treaty. So in the Cold War, Kissinger was thought to be an anti-India person, but later, in his later life, he became one of the foremost supporters of India as a democratic state and an asset, and a great critique of both China and Pakistan, which is very paradoxical, and human beings can change. As Kissinger himself used to say, that no country has permanent interests. It has only temporary interests. It doesn't have permanent friends, only temporary friends. So this was one of the realist statements that he made. So with this, we complete one of the major schools of international relations, and that is realism. And from this, we will move from the neoclassical realism into neorealism, which is also a very predominant school in international relations, in our next lecture. Thank you so much.